4 months. That is the number that now defines this investigation, not as a milestone of progress, but as a measure of what the family of an 84-year-old woman who has been missing since January 31st has had to absorb in the absence of an arrest, in the absence of a confirmed location, in the absence of the kind of definitive investigative result that a case of this scale, this public visibility, and this evidentiary density should have been approaching long before this point. The house is empty. Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home sits without her, without the ordinary rhythms of her daily life, without the presence that her neighbors described as vivacious, and that her family depended on in ways that ran counter to the usual assumptions about who depends on whom in a multi-generational household. 4 months of emptiness. 4 months of an investigation that has described itself in terms of ongoing progress without producing the outcome that progress is supposed to generate. And now, in the most telling possible signal of where the family's trust in that progress actually stands, comes the report that Savannah Guthrie has retained private investigators, and that the financial commitment to doing so may have reached $500,000. The decision to hire private investigators when a missing persons case is nominally being managed by official law enforcement is not a casual one. It is a statement. It says, without requiring any accompanying explanation, that the family has reached the conclusion that the official investigation is not moving fast enough, is not covering enough ground, or is not trusted to prioritize the right lines of inquiry without external pressure. A retired FBI agent who reacted to the report exclusively offered the measured assessment that hiring a private investigator is not a complete answer, which is true in a specific operational sense because private investigators do not have subpoena power, cannot compel testimony, cannot make arrests, and cannot access the official forensic and intelligence databases that law enforcement can access. But the agent's comment, however measured, does not address the reason the family has taken this step. It does not address the 4 months of watching an investigation claim progress while a house sits empty in Tucson. It does not address the increasingly frustrated state that observers close to the family have described, a frustration that has been building across the full arc of this case, and that has now found its expression in a $500,000 commitment to finding answers independently. The significance of what private investigators can actually accomplish in this context depends heavily on what specific work they are being directed to do. If the family's frustration centers on the correspondence review that behavioral profilers recommended weeks ago, the systematic examination of years of documented contact attempts, fan communications, and social media interactions that the profilers believe holds the identity of the person responsible, then a well-resourced private investigation team focused on that specific analytical task might accomplish something that the official investigation has not yet prioritized. If the concern is geographic, covering areas or individuals that the county investigation has not yet reached, private investigators with resources and local knowledge can move in ways that official agencies sometimes cannot, without the bureaucratic friction, the interagency tension, or the institutional baggage that has characterized the county sheriff's department's management of this case from the beginning. The retired FBI agent's comment that it is not a complete answer is accurate, but it does not preclude the private investigation from being a meaningful part of the answer that is eventually found. The Sheriff's Department chose this week to break what had been weeks of near-total public silence with its first substantive statement in that period. The statement insisted that the investigation is far from a dead end and that small details may still prove to be significant. That language, careful, institutional, calibrated for public reassurance without making specific claims, tells the analytical observer something about where the investigation stands from the inside. Far from a dead end is a phrase that communicates ongoing activity without confirming direction. Small details may still be significant is a phrase that communicates that investigators are working at the granular level of evidence that a stalled investigation typically occupies when the large leads have been exhausted, and what remains is the patient, painstaking examination of what has not yet been fully connected. Sheriff Nanos, in statements confirming progress, has maintained the communication posture that has defined his public presence throughout this case. Institutional language that confirms the investigation is active without providing the specificity that would allow an outside observer to evaluate whether the activity is genuinely moving toward resolution. The gap between the statement and the reality of 4 months without an arrest is the gap that a family in increasing frustration is no longer willing to fill with the benefit of the doubt. The single most operationally significant new development in this case is the confirmation from sources that the masked suspect who appeared at Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of her disappearance was not making his first visit to the property on January 31st. He had been there before. Approximately 3 weeks before the abduction, the same masked figure was observed at her home. That detail does not merely add a data point to the existing timeline. It fundamentally reframes the nature of the crime. A person who visits a target location 3 weeks before an abduction is conducting reconnaissance. They are learning the layout, the approach routes, the points of entry and exit, the rhythms of the property's occupancy, the timing of activities that signal when a specific person will be alone and accessible. They are not acting on impulse. They are not acting on a plan that was constructed the night before. They are constructing a plan over a period of weeks, testing it against the reality of the target location, and returning when the plan is ready to be executed. The behavioral implications of this pre-visit are significant, and they connect directly to the profile that retired FBI profilers have developed for the person responsible. A stalker-type fixation that builds over years and eventually resolves into direct action would, in its operational phase, include exactly this kind of preparatory reconnaissance. You do not approach a target you have studied from a distance for years without first confirming that the physical reality of the location matches what your accumulated intelligence about it suggests. The 3-week pre-visit is the physical validation of knowledge that was gathered through other means, correspondence monitoring, public information about the family, whatever access to details about Nancy's living situation the perpetrator had developed over the period of their fixation. The night of January 31st was not the beginning of this story. It was the operational conclusion of a process that had been building for a period that investigators are still working to fully define. A former sheriff who has offered public commentary on this case made a statement this week that deserves careful consideration. The suspect's name may already exist somewhere in the investigative record. This is not a casual observation. It is a professional assessment, grounded in the specific experience of how investigations of this type typically progress about the state of the evidentiary record after 4 months of work. What the former sheriff is saying is that the volume of tips, correspondence reviews, witness interviews, cellular data analysis, and forensic evidence that 4 months of active federal and county investigation has generated is likely to contain somewhere within it a reference to the person responsible, not a confirmation, not a smoking gun identification, but a name, a person who appeared in some context of the investigation and was noted but not yet elevated to primary focus, or a person whose name connects to multiple pieces of evidence that have not yet been cross-referenced against each other in a way that produces the recognition of their significance. The answer may not require a new discovery. It may require the right analyst with the right question looking at what is already there. The CrimeCon panel that revealed new details in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance brought together investigators, legal analysts, and forensic professionals in a public forum where elements of the case were examined in the kind of structured, cross-disciplinary environment that produces analytical insights that no single investigative perspective generates alone. CrimeCon, as a venue, represents the intersection of serious investigative analysis and public engagement, a space where the people who work on cases professionally engage with the community of observers who follow those cases closely. The new details that emerged from that panel have not been fully detailed in public reporting, but the fact that the panel produced enough new material, generates specific coverage, indicates that the examination of this case by professionals in a concentrated public context is still surfacing things that the broader coverage has not yet fully examined. What those details are and how they connect to the other threads currently active in the investigation remains an open question that the official investigative structure has not yet addressed in its own communications. The bones found near Nancy Guthrie's home, which generated an immediate and understandable wave of public dread when the discovery was first reported, have now been assessed by an expert as centuries old. That finding is significant in two directions simultaneously. In the direction that matters most to the family, it removes the most feared implication of the discovery, that the bones were connected to Nancy, that the search for a missing person had become the recovery of remains. They are not connected. The material is so old, predating the investigation by generations, predating the modern residential neighborhood by what appears to be a substantial period, that its presence near the home is a reflection of the archaeological history of the area rather than a forensic development in the current case. In the direction that matters to the analytical observer, The resolution of the Bones question closes a thread that had been generating public attention and directing investigative resources toward a determination that, once made, confirms the investigation must continue to look elsewhere. Expert commentary on whether Nancy Guthrie is alive, offered in the context of the 4-month mark, represents the kind of assessment that the public and the family both need to hear and neither fully wants to receive. The honest answer, from any experienced professional who operates within the evidential framework available, is that no one outside the investigation can say with certainty. What can be said, and what experienced professionals do say in these circumstances, is that the probability assessment changes over time, that the statistical likelihood of a living person's survival in a situation like this one is affected by time in ways that cannot be wished away, and that the investigation's obligation to find answers does not depend on the answer being the one the family hopes for. The family deserves honesty, since they also deserve the humanity of not having that assessment delivered as the dominant frame through which their loved one's case is discussed. The investigation is still active. The evidence is still being processed. The private investigators are in the field. The answer is not yet known, and not yet knowing is a different state from knowing the worst. The JLR controversy, the YouTuber covering this case, who was allegedly removed from CrimeCon over harassment claims, with videos of the incident emerging publicly, is a small story in the context of the investigation itself, but a revealing one in the context of the media ecosystem that has grown up around it. When independent content creators who cover active missing persons cases bring their work to the same physical space as the professional investigators, legal analysts, and forensic experts who work those cases in official capacities, the interactions that result can be productive or they can be harmful. The harassment allegation, whatever its specific nature, reflects a tension that has been visible in the coverage of this case from the beginning. The line between engaged, responsible independent analysis and the kind of behavior that creates harm for witnesses, family members, and the investigative process itself is not always clearly marked. And the people closest to the case, the professionals, the family, the people with direct knowledge, are not always protected from the consequences when that line is crossed. Savannah Guthrie's growing frustration with the pace of the investigation, described by those close to her as increasingly visible, is the human dimension of what the institutional record has been documenting in bureaucratic language for 4 months. Every communication from the sheriff's department that describes ongoing progress without specifying what that progress consists of. Every statement that confirms the investigation is not a dead end without explaining what roads it is still traveling. Every week of silence broken only by the kind of carefully worded reassurance that answers no question the family actually has. The frustration is the natural human response to institutional language that is designed to communicate without revealing, to reassure without committing, to maintain the appearance of accountability without providing its substance. The family has spent 4 months receiving that language and waiting for the result it promises. The result has not arrived. The frustration is rational, documented, and now visible in the form of a $500,000 investment in finding answers outside the official structure. The sheriff's latest communication, confirming progress, insisting on the significance of small details, describing the investigation as far from a dead end, arrives at a moment when the public's capacity to evaluate those claims has been shaped by 4 months of the same kind of communication. Progress has been a recurring theme of official statements throughout this case. Small details have been repeatedly invoked as the basis for continued investigative activity. The investigation has been consistently described as active, ongoing, and moving. None of those descriptions has produced the result that they collectively suggest should be approaching. The analytical observer, reading the current statement against the full archive of statements that preceded it, is left with the assessment that the institutional communication strategy has remained consistent while the investigative outcomes have not matched the language used to describe them. That gap between institutional communication and observable result is the space in which the family's frustration lives and in which the private investigation decision was made. The former sheriff's comment that the suspect's name may already be in the investigative record is the most operationally useful public statement made about this case in recent weeks, and it deserves to be treated as the serious professional assessment it is, rather than as a dramatic claim. Former law enforcement officials with experience in investigations at this scale understand something about the structure of an investigative record after 4 months of active work that the public does not. It is large, it is dense, It is filled with cross-references that have not yet been made, and it contains within it a pattern that when the right analyst asks the right question of the right data set, resolves into an identification. The suspect's name may be there in the form of a cellular record that was flagged and not yet fully cross-referenced against other data. It may be there in the form of a witness statement that mentioned a person in a context that seemed unrelated at the time. It may be there in the correspondence archive that the FBI profilers have been asking investigators to review systematically. It may be there in a connection between the pre-visit 3 weeks before the abduction and a person whose presence in the neighborhood was noted somewhere. The point is that 4 months of active investigation generates a record, and that record, when examined with the right question by the right analyst at the right moment, sometimes reveals what has been there all along. This is the point in covering this investigation where staying connected matters in the most practical sense. The development that changes this case, the forensic identification from the laboratory, the investigative breakthrough that converts the former sheriff's intuition about the suspect's name into a confirmed identification, the result of Savannah's private investigation, where the CrimeCon revelation that works its way into the official record is coming. Whether it comes in days or weeks is not something anyone on the outside can determine. What is determinable is that the investigation is at a stage where the accumulation of 4 months of evidence, the behavioral profile on the table, the pre-visit confirmation 3 weeks before the abduction, the private investigative resources now in the field, and the official acknowledgement of ongoing progress are all pointing toward a moment when something that has been known internally becomes something that is known publicly. Subscribe so that you are here when that moment arrives. The analytical framework that makes that moment legible is built from everything that has come before it, and the people who have been building it alongside the investigation are the ones who will understand immediately what the next development means. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 4 months. Her house is empty. The investigation has not produced an arrest. The family is in agony, increasingly frustrated, and has committed extraordinary personal resources to finding answers that the official structure has not yet provided. A masked suspect came to that house 3 weeks before he came to take her. A former sheriff believes the name investigators need may already exist in what they have. The bones near the home are centuries old and not connected to this case. The sheriff says it is not a dead end, and somewhere in the record of 4 months of active federal and county investigation, in a correspondence archive, in a cellular data set, in a tip that connected to another tip that connected to a person, the answer is already there. It is waiting for the question that unlocks it. That question may already have been asked. The answer may already be known to the people who are not yet ready to say it publicly. And when they are ready, this case will break open in a single moment, and everything that seemed like a dead end will suddenly look like the long path that led exactly where it needed to go.